What if the blade never fell? Imagine a timeline where the history we know, the definitive end of the Tudor rose, was merely a grand deception. For those of us who dwell in the archives, rethinking reality is not just a pastime. It is a thrilling necessity. Today, we invite you to explore a shocking pivot that rewrites 5 centuries of global destiny. This is an exploration of a path not taken, a narrative journey into the impossible that is absolutely worth the wait. The air on May 19, 1536, was thick with the scent of river mud and impending finality. Queen Anne Boleyn, dressed in a kirtle of crimson and a robe of damask, knelt upon the Tower Green. The Frenchman from Calais, a master of the sword, stood poised. In our reality, the strike was clean, a swift conclusion to the tragedy of the king's great matter. But here, in this divergence, the world shudders. Just as the executioner's hands tightened on the hilt, a cry rang out from the gates, not of mercy, but of a logistical necessity so profound it would alter the trajectory of human history until the year 2025. In this immersive reconstruction, we see the minute details, the glint of the morning sun on the steel, the gasp of the crowd, and the sudden, jarring intervention of Thomas Cromwell's agents. This was no act of love from Henry VIII, but chillingly analytical decision born of a secret so volatile it required Anne's survival as a silent shadow queen. As the sword was lowered, the weight of the taken path versus our own reality became palpable. The atmosphere of the tower changed from a site of execution to the cradle of a temporal anomaly. While the world believed the queen was dead, a clandestine arrangement began, a bargain that would grant Anne a fugitive existence in the Flemish wilderness, fueled by an alchemical gift that defied biology. The rigor of this what-if scenario challenges everything we understand about the Tudor line. This is the moment the clock of eternity began to tick for a woman who would witness the rise and fall of empires, the birth of the digital age, and the final sunset of 2025. Prepare yourself. The truth behind this pivot is as haunting as it is magnificent. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the history of the Western world stood at a precipice of annihilation. In our reality, the French swordsman's blade found its mark, severing the Tudor line's most controversial branch. However, beneath the shadow of the White Tower, a shocking pivot was orchestrated by the one man whose mind functioned like a clockwork engine of statecraft, Thomas Cromwell. This was not a moment of mercy, but a thrilling exercise in rethinking reality. Cromwell, the king's fixer, recognized a variable the records chose to ignore, a biological resilience in and that defied the era's understanding. As the crowd pressed forward, craving the morbid spectacle, a secret bargain was struck within the damp, limestone walls. Cromwell did not seek to save a woman. He sought to preserve a secret weapon. The arrangement was a masterpiece of deception. A condemned prisoner, drugged and obscured by the hood of the condemned, would take the queen's place upon the scaffold, and was to be spirited away under the cover of a merchant's shroud, destined for the Flemish wilderness. This hidden arrangement transformed the execution into a cinematic illusion, a grand piece of theater where the audience witnessed a death that never truly occurred. The weight of this taken path is staggering. While the world mourned or celebrated the fall of the Boleyn War, the true and was being erased from the scrolls of the living to become a phantom of the centuries. The analytical rigor of this alternate timeline suggests that Cromwell's motive was the ultimate insurance policy against the king's mercurial nature. By keeping Anne alive, he held the keys to a legitimacy that could be restored or revoked at his whim. The atmosphere of that morning was thick with the scent of river mud and betrayal. As the sword glinted in the pale London sun, the air crackled with the static of a changing universe. We are forced to ask, What does it mean for a dynasty when its most potent catalyst remains in the shadows? This was the birth of the Shadow Queen, a fugitive life beginning in the cold mist of Flanders, preserved by a biology that would eventually outlast the very stones of the tower. It was a bargain that defied God, king, and time itself, setting the stage for a 500-year odyssey through the heart of human progress. The French swordsman did not strike the neck of a queen, but the air above a straw-filled decoy. This shocking pivot in the historical record, a secret bargain struck in the damp corridors of the tower, flung Anne Boleyn from the pinnacle of Tudor power into the brutal obscurity of the Flemish wilderness. As we begin rethinking reality, we find a woman who was once the center of the English Reformation, now reduced to a phantom, a shadow queen, haunting the mist-choked marshes of the Low Countries. The Flemish landscape of 1536 was a labyrinth of shifting allegiances and unforgiving terrain. Here, the thrilling tension of her survival met the cold reality of absolute isolation. Living under the pseudonym of Anne von Mechelen, she inhabited a world of thatched hovels and silent convents, a far cry from the velvet-lined galleries of Whitehall. This was not merely an escape, it was a total erasure of the self. While Henry VIII sought solace in the arms of Jane Seymour and was learning the language of the peat bogs and the survivalist instincts of the stateless, the atmosphere of this alternate world is painted in hues of gray and iron. In our timeline, Anne is a martyr. Here, she is a biological anomaly in the making, her cells beginning to exhibit the first signs of the alchemist's gift, a strange, unnatural resilience that would eventually span half a millennium. The weight of the taken path is palpable. Every day spent in the Flemish wilderness was a day the Tudor line diverged further from our history books. She watched from across the channel as her daughter Elizabeth was declared a bastard, a sight that fueled a cold, immortal fire within her. Analysts today point to this period as the crucible of her character. No longer the flirtatious courtier, she became a student of the long game. This fugitive life was the price of a heartbeat. It was a thrilling, harrowing transition from being the most hated woman in England to being the most secret woman in the world. As she walked the frozen dikes of Flanders, the Shadow Queen began to realize that her life was no longer measured in seasons, but in centuries. The Flemish wilderness was not her grave, but her cocoon, preserving a Renaissance mind for a future no one could yet imagine. The year was 1542, and while the English courts celebrated the fall of another queen, Catherine Howard, the true Anne Boleyn was undergoing a biological metamorphosis that would leave modern science gasping for breath. Within the labyrinthine marshes of the Low Countries, Anne, now living as Anne von Mechelen, encountered a circle of radical Paracelsian alchemists. This encounter would provide a shocking pivot in human history, rethinking reality itself. The alchemist's gift was not a philosopher's stone for gold, but a biological intervention that defied the very concept of cellular decay. In this thrilling narrative departure, we witness the taken path, wherein consumes a potent experimental elixir, a distillation of rare mountain minerals and bioluminescent fungi, designed to combat the pestilential damp of the Flemish wild. The result was a chillingly cinematic transformation. Her body simply stopped aging. Scientists in our timeline would call it a near-perfect cellular stasis or telomere regeneration. But to the fugitive queen, it was a terrifying, divine blessing. She watched with wide-eyed awe as her hands remained unlined while the seasons turned with brutal speed, a shocking contrast to the rot and gangrene devouring the Tudor dynasty across the channel. This biology, defying the decades, transformed and into a living archive, an immortal strategist who viewed the rise and fall of empires with the cold, analytical gaze of a woman who knew she would outlive them all. The weight of this perpetual life began to settle upon her like an iron shroud, as she realized that her survival was no longer a matter of escaping the sword, but of mastering the centuries. It was a staggering deviation from our recorded history, a moment where the biological trajectory of a single human changed the fundamental momentum of the world. While Henry's health plummeted into a tragic caricature of power, his legs ulcerated and his mind fracturing, and stood in the Flemish mist, a youthful sentinel awaiting the moment when her daughter, Elizabeth, would need a guardian who could never die. As the decades began to blur, the psychological toll of her immortality became as significant as the biological miracle. She was a woman frozen in her late 20s, possessing the wisdom of an octogenarian before she had even reached her 50th year. This intellectual disparity allowed her to perceive political shifts with a clarity that bordered on the prophetic, ensuring her survival through the shifting sands of European power. This was the dawn of the Shadow Queen, a figure who would eventually bridge the gap between the Renaissance and the digital age, holding secrets that would remain locked within her blood for 500 years. The sheer audacity of her survival challenges every historical norm, forcing us to imagine a Tudor ghost that never truly departed the stage. The bells of London pealed with a frantic, joyous intensity that November morning in 1558, marking more than just the end of Mary Tudor's bloody reign. For the silent passenger aboard a nondescript merchant vessel slipping through the thick amber Thames fog, the sound represented a shocking pivot in the timeline of the human soul. Anne Boleyn, a woman the world believed had been silenced by the executioner's sword 22 years prior, was coming home. Rethinking reality becomes an exercise in intellectual vertigo when one considers the weight of this secret return. In our history, Elizabeth I ascended as the Virgin Queen effectively orphaned. In this breathtaking alternate reality, she was shadowed by a mother whose biological clock had been frozen by alchemical intervention, and stood on the deck, her face hidden beneath a heavy woolen hood, observing the city she had once ruled with a gaze that had seen more than any mortal eye should. The atmosphere was electric, a thrilling mixture of national relief and private trepidation. She was no longer the desperate queen of 1536, but a sentinel refined by decades of Flemish exile and the strange, invigorating tinctures of the alchemists. This was the moment history fractured. As Elizabeth moved toward the Tower of London, the very sight of Anne's supposed demise, the immortal mother followed in the teeming crowds, a living ghost ensuring the crown did not slip from the Tudor line. The cinematic detail of the coronation was not merely a ceremony of state, but a private reconciliation between a forgotten past and a fragile future. Anne's presence in the cold shadows of the rafters at Westminster Abbey provided a silent guardianship that would shape the Elizabethan age. This was not the haunting of a martyr, but a strategic observer rethinking the very essence of power. To imagine and watching her daughter take the throne is to witness a shocking pivot from the tragedy we know. She was the hidden architect, the shadow behind the throne, preparing to guide England through the storms of the coming centuries. The weight of the taken path was palpable. While the world saw a lone woman taking the throne, the reality was a clandestine partnership between a mortal daughter and an immortal mother, forever altering the trajectory of the British Empire. The cliffs of Dover in August 1588 served as a jagged balcony to an impending apocalypse. To the common soldier, the sight of the Spanish Armada was the end of the world. To Anne Boleyn, shrouded in a heavy wool cloak that masked her eternally youthful features, it was a thrilling, high-stakes manifestation of her own survival. For a woman who should have been a ghost since 1536, witnessing her daughter, Elizabeth, defy the terrestrial might of the Habsburg Empire represented a shocking pivot from the tragedy of the past. It was a moment where the rethinking of reality became a visceral, breathing necessity. This was not just a naval engagement, it was the ultimate test of the Tudor line she had died and lived to preserve. Rethinking reality is the burden of the immortal, and as Anne watched the Spanish crescent loom on the horizon, she recalled the stifling influence of Catherine of Aragon's court. The stakes in 1588 were no longer the whims of a volatile king, but the very sovereignty of an island nation that Anne had helped to reshape through her own defiance. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and the electric tension of a kingdom on the brink. Through her analytical lens, Anne saw the English fleet not merely as ships, but as the physical embodiment of the Reformation's resilience. The cinematic horror of the conflict unfolded as the English launched their fire ships from Calais, turning the night sky into a canvas of amber and ash. From her vantage point on the white precipice, Anne saw the tactical brilliance of the English commanders, men who unknowingly fought to protect the legacy of a woman they believed long dead. When the legendary Protestant wind began to howl, scattering the Duke of Medina Sidonia's lumbering giants toward the treacherous North Sea, the atmosphere shifted from desperation to triumph. This was the moment the Tudor line transcended mortality to become myth, and felt the profound weight of the centuries ahead. She was the silent guardian of this success, the hidden architect of the morale that sustained the throne. The Armada's defeat was a cosmic validation of the path taken in the Tower 50 years prior. As the wreckage of the old world drifted away on the churning tides, Anne stood resolute. She was no longer just a mother or a queen. She was the living memory of England, preparing to endure the long, winding road of a history she was never meant to inhabit. The year 1603 arrived not with a flourish of trumpets, but with a labored, rattling breath that echoed through the drafty, candle-lit corridors of Richmond Palace. To the gathered courtiers, it was the inevitable sunset of the Virgin Queen. However, for the hidden Anne Boleyn, this was a shocking pivot that defied the very laws of nature and the human heart. In a thrilling subversion of historical destiny, the mother who had been legally erased from existence in 1536 stood as a silent, invisible vigil over the daughter who had defined a century. This moment forces a rethinking reality. The image of a mother, her features still locked in the vibrant grace of her 30s, thanks to the alchemist's forbidden gift, clutching the liver-spotted hand of a 70-year-old monarch. It was a cinematic tableau of chronological cruelty that no poet of the age could have dared describe. As Elizabeth I, the great lioness of England, lay upon her cushions, the air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the crushing weight of a dying dynasty. When the final, shallow breath left Elizabeth's lungs at 3 a.m, the Tudor line was publicly severed, yet it pulsed on in the shadows, a secret heartbeat maintained by the immortal Anne. The transition to the Stuart era was not merely a shift in the royal crest. It was a soul-wrenching transformation for the woman who had birthed the Golden Age. As James VI of Scotland journeyed south to claim a crown that it had once worn with such tragic consequence, she retreated into the Flemish mists, mourning the child who had surpassed her in legend but succumbed to the mortality and had been cursed to evade. This was the moment the narrative of England shifted toward the unknown, leaving and as the sole, silent repository of Tudor memory. She watched from the periphery as the world moved on, a survivor in a kingdom that flourished under her daughter's ghost while she remained an eternal ghost herself. The bells of London tolled for the Queen, but for Anne, they tolled for the end of her personal world. She observed the funeral procession from a distance, cloaked in the anonymity of the masses, seeing the effigy of her daughter and realizing that her role as a mother had ended, while her role as an eternal witness had only just begun. The shocking pivot from the Tudors' fiery resolve to the Stuarts' intellectual vanity felt like a cold wind through the palace she once called home, marking the start of a new, lonelier era of her perpetual watch over the English soul. As the clocks of a restored London struck midnight on September 2nd, 1666, the woman once known as Anne Boleyn stood within a shadowed alcove in Pudding Lane. For over a century, she had navigated the currents of time as a ghost in her own kingdom, but the searing heat of that night forced a shocking pivot in her long, solitary vigil. The Great Fire was not merely an accident of sparks and timber, it was a thrilling, albeit terrifying, consumption of the medieval world she had once shared with Henry VIII. This was a moment of rethinking reality. The London of her youth, a city of narrow, jettied houses and Tudor memories, was being systematically erased by a relentless wall of flame. To the intellectual historian, Anne's presence during the Inferno is a staggering revelation, a narrative pivot that redefines our understanding of the Stuart era. While Charles II and the Duke of York fought the blaze with buckets and primitive pumps, the immortal Queen observed the scene with a perspective forged in the 1530s. She watched as the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral melted like wax, cascading down the stone like tears for a lost era. The atmosphere was cinematic and suffocating, thick with the scent of burning cedar and ancient history. For Anne, escaping the Inferno was a desperate race against a city that had become a kiln. She moved through the panicked crowds with a grace that defied her surroundings, a Renaissance mind navigating a Baroque disaster. This event serves as a profound analytical marker in her timeline. The fire did not just destroy buildings, it purged the physical remnants of her Tudor past, forcing her into a state of total reinvention. As she reached the safety of the Thames, watching the horizon glow with a hellish luminescence, the weight of her perpetual life became an unbearable gravity. This was the ember that would fuel her journey into the Enlightenment, a survivor of the sword now surviving the flame, proving that while dynasties fall and cities burn, the woman who refused to die remained the most resilient artifact of the English soul. The Great Fire of 1666 was not her end, but a violent, purifying baptism into a modern world she was destined to outlive. As the embers of the Great Fire cooled, a shocking pivot occurred in the trajectory of the immortal Anne Boleyn. The medieval ghost had been exorcised by the Inferno of 1666, and from the ashes emerged a Renaissance mind forced to navigate the thrilling, cold clarity of the Enlightenment. This was the era of the Enlightenment paradox. A woman born into a world of alchemy, courtly love, and the divine right of kings was now compelled to contend with a reality defined by calculus, gravity, and social contracts. It was a period of rethinking reality itself, a cinematic transformation of the human landscape that Anne watched from the mahogany shadows of London's burgeoning coffee houses. Disguised under a succession of identities, she witnessed the founding of the Royal Society, feeling a chilling resonance between the ruthless pragmatism of her old nemesis Thomas Cromwell and the cold, empirical eyes of the new scientists. To Anne, the Age of Reason was a psychological battlefield. She carried the visceral memory of the smell of burning heretics and the heavy silence of the Tower, yet she found herself reading Isaac Newton's Principia with a seasoned, analytical hunger. The paradox was profound. She was a living relic of a mystical, blood-soaked past, yet she possessed a more adaptable intellect than the youngest radicals of the 1700s. She watched as the heavens she once believed were governed by angelic choirs were dismantled into a clockwork universe. This transition was not merely historical. It was an existential crisis. While her daughter Elizabeth had stabilized a kingdom through iron-willed myth-making, these new thinkers were stripping the myth away entirely and became a silent, anonymous patron of the arts and sciences, a hidden hand guiding the very minds who would eventually question the existence of the divine, the same divinity she once credited for staying the headsman's axe. The Enlightenment forced the immortal queen to decide if she was a creature of God's miraculous grace or a biological anomaly in a world that no longer believed in miracles. This chapter of her life remains a thrilling testament to human resilience, as she traded the velvet of the Tudor court for the intellectual rigors of the modern mind, proving that to survive centuries, one must be willing to let their oldest certainties die. The year 1793 presented a shocking pivot in the long, clandestine life of Anne Boleyn. For a woman who had once stood upon the scaffold in the Tower of London, hearing the expectant silence before the strike of the executioner's sword, the rhythmic thud of the French guillotine felt like a haunting, mechanical echo of her own past. Now calling herself Citoyenne Anne, she moved through the cobblestone streets of Paris, a city gripped by a fever that threatened to consume every vestige of the old world. This was the thrilling, terrifying climax of the Enlightenment, a moment where the logic she had studied under the tutelage of Locke and Newton was being twisted into a blood-soaked instrument of state purity. To witness the fall of the Bourbons was to endure a traumatic, rethinking reality. And who had once been the catalyst for the English Reformation and the spark of the Tudor Golden Age, now watched as the very concept of monarchy was systematically decapitated. She stood in the Place de la Révolution, her face obscured by a modest linen bonnet, watching as Marie Antoinette, a queen who shared her penchant for defiance and the burden of public vilification, ascended the wooden steps. The irony was suffocating. Centuries ago, Anne's death was meant to stabilize a dynasty. Here, death was being used to dismantle the very idea of dynasties. The atmosphere was cinematic in its dread, a landscape of tricolor cockades and the metallic scent of the national razor. For Anne, the terror was not merely a political upheaval, but a visceral reminder of the fragility of power. She had survived the whims of a volatile king, Henry VIII, but the collective wrath of a hungry, radicalized populace was a different beast entirely. It forced a profound recalibration of her survival strategy. In this new world, the divine right of kings was a decaying corpse, and she, a living relic of that divine age, had to navigate a landscape where her very existence was an ideological heresy. As the blade fell, and felt the weight of her immortality more keenly than ever. She was the only living soul who remembered the warmth of the Renaissance, now watching it be extinguished by the cold, industrial precision of the terror. It was a pivotal moment in her 5-century journey, a realization that while she could outlive men and empires, the ghosts of the scaffold would follow her into every new age. The air inside Windsor Castle in 1887 was thick with the scent of beeswax and the stifling weight of a mourning empire. For Anne Boleyn, now an impossible observer of 4 centuries, the meeting was a thrilling collision between the ghost of the Renaissance and the iron reality of the industrial age. Walking through the velvet shadows of the corridors, and felt the jarring resonance of history. She had seen the Tudor sunset and the Stuart line fracture. Now, she stood before Queen Victoria, the woman who had transformed the English crown into a global mechanical behemoth. This was no ordinary meeting of monarchs. It was a private audience that forced a rethinking of reality. Victoria, the widow of Windsor, sat small and formidable, a stark contrast to the tall, lithe figure of the woman who should have been dust since 1536. To Victoria, and was the secret of the archives, a whispered legend kept by the prime ministers, a living relic of the very foundation of the Anglican Church. The dialogue was a shocking pivot from the diplomacy of old, and, having survived the guillotine's shadow in Paris, spoke not of divine right, but of the terrifying fragility of empires. "You govern through steam and telegraphs," Anne reportedly remarked, her voice a melodic haunting of a bygone courtly tongue. "Yet the heart of a people remains as volatile as it was when my husband sought to break the world for a glance." The atmosphere was electric, cinematic in its gravity. Victoria looked upon the face that had launched the English Reformation and saw not a ghost, but a warning. For Anne, the Empress of India represented the ultimate taken path, a version of Britain that had traded the volatile passions of the Tudors for the cold, unyielding progress of the machine. As they sat in the dim light of the library, the weight of the centuries pressed upon them, and witnessed the peak of British hegemony, yet her eyes, which had seen the Great Fire and the French Terror, looked past the industrial fog to the eventual decay that follows all grand designs. This private audience was the ultimate synthesis of the old world and the new, a moment where the immortal survivor and the Empress of the globe shared a silent, profound understanding. That power is merely a temporary lease against the relentless march of time. As the 19th century reached its crescendo, the world Anne Boleyn had once known was not merely fading. It was being incinerated in the furnace of progress. The industrial fog, adapting to a world of steam and iron, represents a shocking pivot in our understanding of the Tudor survivor's journey. By the 1890s, the pastoral serenity of the 1530s, a world of falconry, wood smoke, and hand-stitched silk, had been replaced by a soot-stained reality that was, for Anne, a thrilling yet terrifying sensory assault. For a woman whose original lifespan was measured by the natural rhythms of the seasons, the relentless clatter of iron and the scream of steam engines forced a rethinking of reality itself. In this chapter of her long life, Anne watched London transform from a cluster of timbered spires into a sprawling, mechanical leviathan. She moved through the East End, a ghost in the machine, observing as the alchemy of progress turned peasants into factory hands. This was no longer the England of her daughter Elizabeth. This was a landscape of iron bridges and coal-choked skies. To Anne, the steam engine was a beast more formidable than any dragon of medieval lore, a mechanical heart pumping the lifeblood of a new, colder empire. The narrative weight of this era is staggering. While the world marveled at the speed of the locomotive and mourned the loss of silence, she realized that humanity was undergoing a fundamental metamorphosis, trading the soul of the soil for the efficiency of the gear. This section captures her analytical distance as she walks the Thames, now a toxic artery of industry, reflecting on how the sword that almost took her life was a primitive tool compared to the machines now forging the future. The contrast between the velvet-clad halls of her youth and the iron-wrought grime of the Victorian age provides a cinematic vista of a woman out of time, surviving not just the centuries, but the very destruction of the world she first called home. It is a haunting exploration of adaptation, proving that for an immortal, the greatest challenge is not the passing of years, but the accelerating velocity of human invention that threatens to leave the past in the dust. The air in 1914 did not smell of the wood smoke and lavender of the Tudor court. It reeked of ozone coal and the metallic tang of an impending storm. To Anne Boleyn, watching from the periphery of a London club under an assumed identity, the assassination in Sarajevo was not a mere political tremor. It was a seismic rupture. Having navigated the labyrinthine intrigues of the 16th century, she possessed a chillingly unique perspective on the great game. Rethinking reality was a survival mechanism she had honed over 4 centuries. Yet even she was staggered by the shocking pivot from the gilded diplomacy of the Victorian era to the raw, industrialized slaughter of the First World War. She remembered the field of the cloth of gold, a display of peacocking kings and silken tents. That was war as theater, a contest of vanity. This, however, was war as a factory, a mechanical annihilation that rendered the individual obsolete. The mobilization of millions was a thrillingly terrifying spectacle, a machine that had outgrown its masters. As the lights went out across Europe and felt the weight of her immortality like a leaden shroud, She saw the ghosts of the Plantagenets and the Tudors in the eyes of the young men marching to the front. Yet they were being fed into a meat grinder of iron and chemical fire, a technological nightmare that made the daggers of her youth seem like toys. This was the 1914 flashpoint, a moment where the chivalry codes she once manipulated were finally, bloodily discarded. The scale of the conflict forced a radical rethinking of the human condition. She watched as the old empires, the descendants of the very houses she once served and defied, began their agonizing collapse. To Anne, the Great War was the ultimate proof that humanity's capacity for destruction had finally surpassed its capacity for reason. She stood as the sole witness to the transition from the longbow to the Maxim gun, from the knight to the tank. In this atmospheric crucible, the queen who had outlived her own execution realized that the world she once knew was not just fading, it was being vaporized. The 1914 conflict was not just a war, it was the final, violent birth of the modern world. Viewed through the eyes of a woman who had seen the sun set on every era since the Renaissance, now bracing for a century of total fire. The year 1940 heralded a transformation of the London skyline that even the Great Fire of 1666 could not rival. As the Luftwaffe's shadow fell over the Thames, and Boleyn, now a silent sentinel of 4 centuries, found herself rethinking reality within the skeletal remains of the old Palace of Whitehall. It was a thrilling, albeit terrifying, juxtaposition. The very halls where she once danced in velvet were now exposed to the cold, cordite-scented night air. This was the shocking pivot of the modern age. The realization that the stone monuments of the Tudors were as fragile as the reputations of their builders. As the incendiary bombs rained down, turning the night into a hellish noon, and sought refuge in the deep vaulted cellars that had once held Henry's finest wines. The irony was not lost on her. The Tower of London, her former prison, stood defiant against the onslaught, its thick walls enduring while the newer, sleeker structures of the Victorian era crumbled like ash. To witness the Blitz was to see the final, violent erasure of the medieval world she had been born into. The siren's wail replaced the courtly lutes, a mechanical scream that signaled a new, industrial kind of death. Shivering in a tattered wool coat that hid her ageless features, she watched from a fractured window as St. Paul's Cathedral was framed by a halo of fire. It was a cinematic destruction of her daughter's heritage, a total war that demanded she once again reinvent her survival strategy. In this crucible of fire and iron, Anne Boleyn understood that the world had finally developed the tools to match its own capacity for malice. The Tudor line had long since passed into the ink of chronicles, yet here she remained, an enduring ember in the ruins of an empire that was being systematically dismantled from the clouds above. As the damp June air of 1953 clung to the ancient stones of London, the atmosphere was thick with a peculiar, electric hope that felt both alien and intimately familiar to the woman who had seen it all. For Anne Boleyn, standing unnoticed amidst the shivering, rain-slicked crowds, the coronation of Elizabeth II was not merely a state ceremony. It was a thrilling, almost agonizing intersection of 2 disparate worlds. Watching the young woman process toward Westminster Abbey, and felt the crushing weight of a shocking pivot in history. Here was another Elizabeth, bearing the name and the fierce, steady gaze of the daughter and had birthed, loved, and eventually mourned from the long shadows of her secret life. It was a profound exercise in rethinking reality. The Tudor line had officially vanished in 1603, yet the essence of her progeny seemed to have been resurrected in this Windsor girl, encased in the same heavy gold and sacred silk that had once defined Anne's own fleeting rise and brutal fall. The spectacle of the gold state coach was a cinematic echo of the pageantry, and remembered from her own coronation in 1533, yet the context was entirely anachronistic. This was a world of television cameras, flashing bulbs, and global radio broadcasts, a far cry from the whispered rumors and heraldic trumpets of the Henrician court. To see the St. Edward's crown placed upon the head of a namesake was a transcendent, immersive experience that bridged 4 centuries. It forced Anne to grapple with the paradox of her own immortality. She was the primordial root of a dynastic tree that had branched into 1,000 unforeseen directions. While the world celebrated a new Elizabethan era with youthful optimism, only and understood the grim cost of the first one. She watched through a lens forged by 4 centuries of survival, recognizing that while the crown remains a terrifying constant, the flesh that wears it is merely a temporary vessel for the nation's soul. In the reflection of the young queen's eyes as she passed by and saw the ghost of her own daughter, a silent, spectral confirmation that though the Tudors were technically extinct, their blood and their legacy were an adaptive, immortal force that refused to surrender to the passage of time. By 1962, the air in London felt heavy, not with the coal smoke of her Victorian years, but with a silent, ionizing dread. For Anne Boleyn, survival had been an art form perfected across 4 centuries, yet the Cuban Missile Crisis presented a thrilling, albeit terrifying, new paradigm. To a woman who had seen the Spanish Armada shattered by a literal wind of God, the prospect of a world-ending fire launched from a silo was a shocking pivot in the human story. She sat in a discreet Kensington flat, the walls lined with text from Erasmus to Einstein, rethinking reality as the ticker tape brought news of the blockade, and was no longer just a fugitive of time. She had become the Cold War whisperer. Using a network of aliases and her unparalleled understanding of power dynamics, she sought to provide counsel that only a Tudor mind could conceive. Through back-channel communications disguised as historical memoranda, she whispered to the advisors of the modern state. Her message was always the same: power is a game of masks, and the ultimate victory is the survival of the chessboard itself. In the cinematic gloom of a London fog, she met with intelligence officers who had no inkling they were speaking to the mother of the original Elizabethan age. To them, she was an enigmatic scholar of unmatched geopolitical intuition. She analyzed Khrushchev's bluster through the lens of Henry VIII's volatile insecurity, recognizing that a cornered tyrant is most dangerous when his pride is pricked. This was a thrilling reimagining of diplomatic strategy, applying 16th century Machiavellianism to the brink of nuclear winter. As the world breathed a collective sigh of relief when the Soviet ships turned back and remained vigilant, she saw the taken path of history as a fragile thread. While others celebrated a diplomatic triumph, she looked at the icons of the nuclear age and saw the same hubris that had once led men to build the tower she had narrowly escaped. The dread was not gone, it had merely been archived. For the woman who had lived a dozen lifetimes, the Cold War was a reminder that while the technology of death had evolved, the cold, calculating hearts of men remained as predictable as they were in 1536. This was the burden of her perpetual life, watching the world nearly succumb to the same fires of ambition she had navigated since the days of the Reformation. As the dawn of the 1980s approached, the world stood on the precipice of a digital metamorphosis, a transformation that would offer the 5-century-old Anne Boleyn her most thrilling challenge yet. For centuries, her survival had depended on the physical, the scratching of quills on vellum, the hiding of leather-bound journals in stone vaults, and the quiet persistence of ink. However, as the Silicon Revolution accelerated, she recognized a shocking pivot in human history. The analog era was fading, and with it, the tangible remnants of her long journey. To preserve her legacy, she began the arduous task of encoding her memories into the binary architecture of the early computing age. This was not merely an act of record-keeping. It was a rethinking of reality itself. Anne, who had once watched William Caxton's printing press revolutionize the Tudor court, now sat before the green phosphorescent glow of a CRT monitor, her fingers dancing across a keyboard with the same grace they once held over a lute. The cinematic contrast was staggering. A woman who had breathed the air of the 1530s now navigated the nascent internet, transforming her first-hand accounts of Henry VIII's volatility into encrypted data packets. This digital migration provided her with a new, ethereal layer of anonymity, allowing her to become a ghost in the machine. While historians in the outside world debated the nuances of the Reformation, and was busy backing up the truth on magnetic tape and early floppy disks, ensuring that her perspective on 5 centuries of human folly would outlive the decay of paper. Yet, this transition brought a chilling realization. In a world where everything was being indexed and searchable, her biological impossibility became a liability. The digital age promised immortality for her words, but threatened exposure for her person. As she watched the world connect through fiber optic cables, she understood that the next century would not just be about surviving time, but about surviving the lens of total surveillance. The weight of her past was now a series of ones and zeros, a binary tapestry of a life that defied every known law of nature, waiting for a future that might finally be equipped to decode her existence. This era marked her transition from a physical fugitive of time to a spectral entity within the global network, a Tudor mind perfectly adapted to the information age. By the turn of the millennium, the shadows that had shielded the woman once known as Anne Boleyn for half a millennium began to dissolve under the sterile, fluorescent lights of the genomic revolution. It was a thrilling yet terrifying epoch for the immortal fugitive. For nearly 500 years, she had survived by changing names, forging papers, and migrating across borders. However, the late 1990s brought a shocking pivot in the nature of identity. No longer was a persona defined by the ink on a parchment ledger or a grainy photograph. It was written in the very marrow of the bone. The atmospheric tension of this new age was palpable as science began to provide the tools to unmask the impossible. The discovery that almost ended her 5-century odyssey occurred in a quiet laboratory in 2004 during a longitudinal study on rare centenarian markers to which she had, perhaps with a touch of hubris, contributed a sample under a pseudonym. The sequence was an anomaly that defied every known law of modern biology. When researchers cross-referenced her markers against the emerging database of historical genetic profiles, the result forced a rethinking of reality itself. The data suggested a direct, identical maternal link to the Tudor remains recovered from the Tower of London, a biological impossibility that sent shockwaves through the elite circle of geneticists. This was the cinematic climax of her long game of hide-and-seek. The forensic evidence pointed to a woman who should have been dust, yet whose blood was as vibrant as a youth's. To the scientific world, she was a miracle to be dissected. To Anne, this was the ultimate trap. She was forced to orchestrate a sophisticated digital erasure, utilizing her vast, centuries-old wealth to manipulate data and frame the match as a catastrophic lab contamination. This near exposure served as a chilling reminder that the digital and biological age offered no sanctuary for a relic of the Renaissance. The weight of the taken path became a heavy burden, as she realized that her very existence was now a scientific heresy. Watching the world decode the secrets of life, the queen who refused to die understood that her greatest enemy was no longer the political intrigue of a king's court, but the inescapable, double helix blueprint of her own cells. It was a high-stakes game of genetic chess, where one stray hair could unravel the most elaborate deception in human history. In the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of Windsor Castle, far from the prying eyes of the digital press. A thrilling secret lay anchored in the heart of the British monarchy. This was not a scandal of the flesh, but a shocking pivot in the narrative of power, the continued presence of Anne Boleyn. By the late 20th century, the woman once branded a temptress had become the matriarch of centuries. As Queen Elizabeth II navigated the turbulent waters of the 1990s, the annus horribilis, and the subsequent media frenzies, she often retreated to a private solar where a woman with 500-year-old eyes waited. Rethinking reality requires us to acknowledge that the stability of the modern Windsor line was not merely a result of tradition, but the direct product of Anne's ancient wisdom. Imagine a cinematic encounter where the Queen, burdened by the dissolution of her children's marriages, sought counsel from a mother who had witnessed the rise and fall of the very dynasties that preceded the Windsors, and did not offer platitudes. She offered the brutal perspective of one who had outlived the very concept of forever. Her advice was a chilling reminder. The crown is a machine of survival, not a vessel for happiness. The transition to the reign of Charles III marked a poignant finale to this secret tutelage. While the world saw a modern king concerned with climate change and heritage, the reality was far more evocative. Behind the scenes, and urged to focus on the long stewardship. She, who had seen the English forests felled for the Armada ships, now guided the king in protecting the land for a future she knew she would soon depart. It was a thrilling paradox, a Tudor ghost advising a 21st century sovereign on the preservation of a world she had watched evolve from mud and steel to data and light. This secret connection redefined the what-if of British history. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the refinement of a dynasty through the eyes of its most resilient ancestor. The shocking pivot of Anne's story in these final decades was her transformation into the ultimate constitutional advisor, an invisible bridge across half a millennium, ensuring that while the world changed with dizzying speed, the core of the monarchy remained tethered to the iron will of a woman who had once defied death at the Tower of London. Imagine the sheer weight of 500 years of memory pressing against a single consciousness. For Anne Boleyn, survival was not merely a physical feat, it was a psychological siege. In this shocking pivot from the history we know, we find a woman who did not perish on a scaffold, but instead endured the slow erosion of time itself. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Queen who once danced in the vibrant halls of Greenwich had become a living palimpsest, her mind a layered record of vanished worlds. The psychological toll was monumental. This wasn't just the thrill of witnessing empires rise. It was the agonizing reality of outliving every child, every friend, and every enemy she had ever known. She watched the Tudor rose wither, the Stuarts fall, and the Hanoverians rise, all while she remained a ghostly constant. Rethinking reality through her eyes requires us to grasp a terrifying isolation. To Anne, the modern world was a cacophony of digital noise that stood in stark contrast to the quiet, candlelight whispers of her youth. In the late 1990s, those close to her noted a deepening temporal fatigue. She described the sensation of her own memories becoming heavier than her body. The burden of centuries wasn't a metaphorical title. It was a medical and spiritual crisis. How does a mind designed for a 60-year span reconcile half a millennium of trauma? She had seen the Great Fire of London, the Blitz, and the Cold War not as history, but as Tuesday afternoons. This cinematic detail of her inner life reveals a harrowing truth. Immortality is a marathon of grief. While the public saw her as a mythic figure, she felt like a fragment of a lost continent drifting in a foreign sea. The shocking pivot in our understanding of and comes when we realize that her greatest struggle wasn't escaping the executioner's sword in 1536, but surviving the relentless march of the 2000s. Her resilience was a thrilling testament to the human spirit, yet it was shadowed by a profound, ancient loneliness that no modern therapy could touch. As she navigated the digital age, she wasn't just a survivor. She was the ultimate witness to the transience of everything except herself. As the world shuttered its doors in March 2020, Anne Boleyn, known to a select few high-level intelligence circles as the Tudor constant, watched the silence descend from a secure, technologically advanced flat in Chelsea. For the 5-century-old survivor, the global pandemic was a haunting, immersive echo of the sweating sickness that had once ravaged the court of Henry VIII. Yet, this modern plague arrived with a thrilling clinical sterility that terrified her more than the bubonic reeks of her youth. It forced a shocking pivot in her existence. The woman who had survived the Spanish Armada, the Great Fire, and the Blitz now found herself an ultimate recluse, rethinking reality through the glow of a high-definition screen. The 2020 lockdown was more than a medical necessity for Anne. It was a psychological crucible that tested the very limits of her perpetual life. While the world panicked, she experienced a profound sense of déjà vu, recalling the 1530s when the royal court fled London for the clean air of the countryside. However, the isolation of the digital age was uniquely taxing. Ensconced in a world of fiber optics and encrypted channels, the former Queen of England navigated the pandemic with a resilience forged in the fires of the Tower. She observed the modern monarchy, her own daughter's distant successors, addressing a frightened nation, feeling the weight of the taken path versus the reality she had inhabited for 484 years. This period marked a cinematic stillness in her long life. The atmosphere of a silent London, devoid of the industrial roar she had grown to tolerate, allowed her to hear the ghosts of her past more clearly than ever. Every digital meeting was a masquerade, every N95 mask a modern veil. She pondered the alchemist's gift, that biology-defying catalyst that had preserved her cells since Thomas Cromwell's secret bargain in 1536. While the world sought a vaccine, she remained a walking laboratory of forgotten endurance. This section of her journey represents a harrowing intersection of medieval survivalism and 21st century technology, where the woman who once wore the crown of England sat in the blue light of a laptop, the last witness to a world that had forgotten how to breathe. It was the final, agonizing quiet before the inevitable storm of 2025. As the digital clock in her sterile, high-security London apartment blinked into the spring of 2025, the woman once known as Anne Boleyn faced a frontier that even her alchemically preserved blood could no longer conquer. It was a thrilling, albeit somber, rethinking of reality. The most famous victim of Henry VIII was not a ghost, but a pulse that had outlasted every stone of the original Whitehall. Within this reinforced sanctuary, the air was thick with the scent of sterile ozone and ancient herbs, a cinematic clash between the 16th and 21st centuries. Her heartbeat, a rhythmic echo that had survived the sweating sickness, the Blitz, and the rise of the internet, was finally stuttering. Medical monitors displayed data that defied modern biology, tracing a lifespan that spanned nearly 5 centuries. For the small, sworn-to-secrecy team of physicians, it was a shocking pivot from everything they knew of human limits. This was not merely the end of a patient. It was the dissolution of a living bridge to the Renaissance. Anne's eyes, still retaining that sharp, obsidian intelligence that had once captivated a king, remained fixed on a digital portrait of her daughter, Elizabeth I. The narrative weight of the taken path was immense. While our reality remembers her as a martyr of 1536, this timeline saw her as the silent, immortal architect of the British psyche. As the sun rose over a London skyline she had seen evolve from timber-framed hovels to glass monoliths, the psychological toll of her perpetual life reached its zenith. There was a profound, immersive gravity in her final silence. She had witnessed the Armada's defeat and the moon landing with the same pair of eyes. Now, the biological anomaly was failing. The alchemist's gift had finally spent its potency, proving that even the most enduring Tudor fire must eventually turn to ash. Her hands, which had once held the quills of poets and the secrets of prime ministers, lay still upon a tablet screen. This final section of her epic journey marks a monumental conclusion to a life that rewrote the laws of nature. The deathbed of Anne Boleyn in 2025 is not just a medical event. It is the closing of the longest, most secret chapter in human history, leaving a world that will never truly understand the magnitude of the legacy it is about to lose. The digital files, encrypted with a cipher that combines 16th century polyalphabetic codes with modern quantum algorithms, were finally unlocked in the late spring of 2025. The result was a chilling, high-definition recording, a confession that forced a global rethinking of reality. Anne Boleyn, a woman whose name had been a synonym for tragedy for 500 years, spoke from beyond the threshold with a voice that carried the crushing weight of 5 centuries. It was a shocking pivot in our understanding of the Tudor era and every epoch that followed. In the recording, she does not merely recount the past. She deconstructs the very fabric of the taken path. "I was the catalyst for a king's madness," she begins, her tone steady yet haunting. "But I became the silent architect of a world I was never meant to see." The atmosphere of the recording is cinematic. One can almost hear the rustle of invisible silks against the sterile, digital hum of her 21st century sanctuary. She details the Great Bargain of 1536, describing how Thomas Cromwell, not the simplistic villain of history, but a desperate pragmatist, facilitated her disappearance into the Flemish mists. The narrative takes a thrilling turn as she describes the psychological toll of her biology-defying life. To watch her daughter, Elizabeth I, age and die while she herself remained locked in a slow-motion stasis of aging was an agony no Renaissance poet could capture. This confession is not merely a historical document. It is a profound meditation on her secret influence. She reveals how her quiet interventions, a whispered word to a minister in 18th century London, a hidden letter during the height of the Cold War, steered the course of history away from total annihilation. As the recording reaches its crescendo, the historical analyst is left breathless. This is the ultimate what if made flesh, and reveals that the Tudor line never truly ended. It merely retreated into the shadows to serve as humanity's secret guardian. Her final words, delivered with a piercing clarity that defies her 500-year residence on Earth, challenge the listener to look at the world anew. "History is not a scroll already written," she whispers. "It is a tapestry being woven by the ghosts you choose to ignore." The 21st century is left to grapple with a legacy that rewrites every textbook and redefines the very nature of time itself. The passing of the woman known to the inner circles of the British Crown as the Constant in early 2025 did more than end a 5-century secret. It initiated a thrilling scientific revolution that forced a complete rethinking of biological reality. For the world's leading geneticists, the post-mortem examination of Anne Boleyn was less of an autopsy and more of a deep dive into a biological miracle that defied the very laws of cellular decay. When her tissues were finally subjected to the rigors of modern CRISPR sequencing and telomere analysis, the results were nothing short of a shocking pivot in our understanding of human potential. Scientists found that her telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that typically fray with age, remained in a state of unnatural stasis, effectively frozen in the year 1536. This was the legacy of the alchemist's gift, a substance once dismissed as the fevered dream of a Flemish mystic, now revealed as an advanced biochemical catalyst that had preserved her cellular integrity across the Great Fire, the Industrial Revolution, and the Nuclear Age. The atmosphere in the subterranean labs of the Francis Crick Institute was cinematic in its tension. Nobel laureates stood in stunned silence as they observed mitochondrial DNA that functioned with 100% efficiency, showing none of the oxidative stress typical of a human who had lived even 80 years, let alone 500. It was a rigorous challenge to the established narrative of human mortality. Analysts began to realize that it had not merely survived. She had been biologically optimized. Her blood carried traces of rare compounds, alkaloids, and mineral salts that suggested a sophisticated, centuries-long regimen of alchemical supplementation that bridged the gap between medieval herbology and futuristic biohacking. This scientific aftermath presented a chilling question. If one woman could endure the weight of half a millennium through a secret bargain and a lost science, what does that mean for the future of the human species? The examination of her biology forced a radical narrative pivot, moving her story from the realms of historical curiosity into the vanguard of longevity science. As the data was synthesized, the world had to grapple with a new, terrifying truth. The Tudor Queen was not a ghost of the past, but a biological prototype for a future we are only beginning to understand. The path taken by Anne Boleyn rewrote the biology of time itself, leaving modern science to pick up the pieces of a shattered reality. The silence that followed in Boleyn's final breath in the spring of 2025 was not merely the passing of a woman, but the closing of a 5-century-long aperture into the very soul of the West. As the global community reels from the shocking pivot of her revealed existence, a historical reality where the executioner's sword never fell in 1536, we are forced into a profound rethinking of reality itself. And was no mere survivor. She was the living bridge across the terrifying abyss of time. From the flickering, smoky torches of the Renaissance to the blinding digital luminescence of the 21st century, her presence acted as a silent, stabilizing force, a biological miracle that defied the very entropy of our species. We must now confront the thrilling realization that our own established history, the one where she perished in the Tower, is perhaps the more fragile and tragic timeline. In this alternate world, the alchemist's gift was not a medieval myth, but a terrifying biological prototype that redefined the human potential for longevity and memory. Looking back from the precipice of her deathbed in 2025, the cinematic detail of her journey is overwhelming. She navigated the guillotine's shadow in France, shared private counsel with Empress Victoria, and felt the tremors of the Blitz from the ruins of her old palaces. The Tudor spirit did not expire in 1603. It evolved, hidden in plain sight, through the eyes of its most resilient matriarch. As historians and geneticists begin to dissect her final recorded confession, the weight of the taken path becomes staggering. We are left to wonder with a sense of dread and awe. How many other moments in our history sit on such a razor's edge? Her survival was a magnificent defiance of the natural order, a shocking pivot that suggests history is not a fixed, immutable path, but a series of choices that can be rewritten by a single heartbeat or a single moment of mercy. In the end, the final verdict is clear. Anne Boleyn did not just survive the court of Henry VIII. She conquered the concept of time itself. Her legacy serves as a haunting, thrilling reflection on the fragility of our own reality, proving that one refused strike of a French sword can echo for half a millennium, fundamentally altering every facet of the human story and leaving us to question the very nature of our mortality.